Well, I have known Tom Friedman for many, many years, dating back to the time when he was the Washington bureau chief, I believe, of the New York Times, and I was stationed at the embassy in Washington. I have met very few people with that level of educated grasp of the complicated intricacies of the Middle East arena. And Tom is undoubtedly, he needs no introduction, certainly not my introduction, and I'm very, very pleased to have this dialogue. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me Thomas Friedman to this dialogue.
Yossi, it's great to be with you, an old friend, and for the Hebrew University as well, where I'm honored to be an honorary doctor. I was never Washington bureau chief, but I was White House bureau chief at one point. So but I appreciate the promotion.
Okay, thank you. Now, Tom, I have hundreds of questions which I could address to you. But since our time is limited, I have chosen for this occasion 3 or 4 main questions which I find most intriguing. And I'm sure that everybody, and we have tonight, I think, several thousands people watching us, will be very interested in your insights. So let me first start with the general questions. You know, in the past, and from the vantage point of the Middle East, the world was a very simple place. The place divided between the good guys and the bad guys. There was the United States and the Soviet Union. And we were aligned, of course, with the good guys, with the United States. Then the Soviet Empire collapsed and the world became unipolar, American. But these days, you see a totally different picture. Russia is much more active on the world front, and especially in our part of the world. The US is somewhat less involved. The Chinese are everywhere. And the Arab world is more engaged with the Israelis. What do you see as the direction, the new direction for our Middle East? Where are we going from here?
Well, Yossi, I think there are 2 trends sort of converging that are reshaping the Middle East. The first trend I would call the new geopolitical divide, which is no longer north, south, east, west, communist, capitalist. I believe the most relevant geopolitical divide in the world today is between what I call the world of order and the world of disorder. So if you think of how the world was governed for millennia, it was really through empires. You know, the Greek and Roman empires, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Mughal Empire. Vast empires governed regions. Only until the 20th, really, in the 21st century, 20th century primarily, did we break up into these nation states after World War I, decolonization, then after World War II. So much so that we woke up in 1945, and the UN had like 190 different nation states, and the Middle East was full of them. With all kinds of crazy right-angle borders. Now, the first 50 years after World War II were a great time to be a weak little state. If you were a weak little state, that was a wonderful time. Why? First of all, there were 2 superpowers competing for your affection, throwing money at you, buying your wheat, sending you foreign aid, building your education capacity, educating your kids at Patrice Lumumba University of Moscow or Wichita State in America. And if you were Syria, you could lose 3 wars, count them, 1, 2, 3 wars to Israel, and get your army rebuilt for free all 3 times. That was good. Second, populations were very limited. Third, climate change was moderate. Fourth, no one had one of these to compare their leader to the leader next door or their mayor to the mayor next door. And lastly, China was not in the World Trade Organization, so everyone could be in the low-wage textile business. My argument, Yossi, is all that flips in the early 21st century. Now, no country, no superpower wants to touch you, basically, because all they win is a bill. Even Syria Russia isn't spending much money in Syria, number 1. Number 2, climate change is hammering these countries now. All kinds of countries in the Middle East experiencing water stress. Third, populations have exploded. 1979, Iran's population around 40 million. Today, over 80 million. And how many in Egypt? I think we've lost track. Now everyone has one of these. And by the way, it also has, it turns out it has an app on it for human traffickers, so I can figure out how to get to Europe. And lastly, China's in the World Trade Organization, so nobody can be in the textile business. You know, Yossi, I was in Tahrir Square in 2011 for the revolution in Egypt. I was gone from my wife for 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, I went home. I was at the Cairo airport, the Treasures of Egypt souvenir shop. I stopped in to buy my little honey something to remind her where I'd been. What do they have there? Well, they had pyramids, ashtrays. My honey doesn't smoke. They had pyramids, bookends. My honey had enough bookends. But they had one thing my honey didn't have. It was a stuffed camel. And if you squeezed its hump, it honked. And it turns out my honey didn't have a honking humped camel. So I picked it up, turned it over, and what did it say on the bottom? Say it with me now. Made in China. Yeah. You're the lowest wage country in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there's now a country half a world away can make your honking humped camel cheaper than you can, ship it and sell it for a profit. So what's happened as a result of this is all these countries are being stressed. All these weak little states that were great in the first 50 years after World War II are now being stressed. Some we blew up on our own, like Iraq. Others are blowing up just fine on their own. Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Eritrea. And basically what's happening in the world is a mass migration of people trying to get out of the world of disorder into the world of order. Israel's got the mini version of this from Africa, and America got the maxi version, and Europe got the maxi version of this. So that's a huge trend. People are seeking out Israel today as an island of order, not for the kosher food, but they're literally walking there to find order and jobs. And those stresses are going to continue because Israel is an island of order in a sea of disorder. That's one trend. The second big trend is that America is leaving the region. We now are the world's biggest oil producer. And as a result, the region is creating its own new square dance of partners. And basically the three large non-Arab civilizational countries, Iran, Israel, and Turkey, are all partnering, are all creating their alliances with regional partners. Turkey with Qatar and Hamas, Iran with Hezbollah and its proxies in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen with the Houthis, and Israel with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, and tacitly with Egypt and Jordan. So the region going forward, I believe, will be defined much more by the need to actually just get order in some of these places that are going to be disorderly. These countries are too late for imperialism now, and they failed at self-governance. So how we're going to get order in places like Gaza, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, not clear. And by these three great regional partnerships between the three big non-Arab powers, Iran, Israel, and Turkey, and their regional allies.
Well, Tom, is speaking of the Gulf countries, is this also one of the reasons for the changes we see from the Emirates, from Bahrain, from Morocco, from Sudan? Or how deep is this change in the Arab world in terms of their relationship, their new relationship with Israel?
Well, I think one has to distinguish between, let's say, UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan because they're different motivations there. But for the UAE, it was clearly America's leaving the region. Iran bombed Abqaiq, the biggest Saudi oil facility, and America did nothing. The message was you're on your own. So the UAE, which already had a tacit relationship with Israel, obviously saw the strategic opportunity to A, secure advanced weapons of its own from America, B, build an alliance with Israel, and C, deal with the post-Arab Spring. The Arab Spring may have failed, but it had a huge impact on the region. The message to every Arab leader was, your countries are filled with young people who want to realize their full potential. And if they can't realize their full potential, they're going to be a very explosive element. The UAE leadership understood that, I believe, and understood that a partnership with Israel on tech, on things Dan was speaking about, on health, on education, on agriculture, was a way for preparing for the post-oil world. you know, what Zaki Yamani, the Saudi oil minister, said in the 1970s is more true than ever. The oil age did not end because we ran out of stones. Sorry, the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. And the oil age is not going to end because we run out of oil. There's going to be a huge amount of oil in the ground when we run out. So you better be prepared. The world is not going to sort of wait for your last drop before it makes the transition. This is a very big year in America right now. What you're seeing in America today is oil companies becoming energy companies. Already happened in Europe with Total and Shell. It's beginning to happen here in America. That is a gigantic shift. And so the UAE, I think because it does have a far-sighted leadership, they saw these trends and they've jumped on the opportunity. And when you put together the most successful Arab state with the most successful non-Arab state, that has a very powerful message in the region. Because if you're a Shia worker in the southern suburbs of Beirut today, and you just spend 2 hours trying to barter eggs for chicken to feed your family because the currency is worthless and the place is so misgoverned under the Hezbollah and its allies. And you look up and you're listening to the news, you catch the broadcast that the UAE and Israel are building all these relationships. You start to ask some questions. Why am I stuck with these people who always want to have the past bury the future? Why can't I be with people who want to have the future bury the past? So this is enormous, subtle geopolitical resonance that a lot of people don't understand.
Well, let me tell you that there's tremendous interest in among the universities in the Gulf in working together with our university. But let's move to Washington for a second. With the new administration in the United States and this inconclusive election results in Israel, how do you see developments regarding Israel-U.S. relationship, especially with the Iran talks about to be resumed? How will that affect U.S.-Israeli ties?
Well, the Biden administration has made clear it wants to do two things. It wants to restore the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and get Iran nuclear program under control, and then try to move on to regional issues. I think that goal is incompatible. I think that the leverage that you need to get Iran to curb its regional behavior is lost the minute you end sanctions in order to get Iran into the nuclear deal. And look, from an American point of view, we don't want to see Iran disperse precision-guided missiles around the region. But our primary concern is Iran's nuclear program. That's what potentially threatens us because it threatens the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I basically am not optimistic that we're going to get restoration of the JCPOA. I think Iran's managed to survive decently without it. And the best, I think, is we're going to get small deal for small lifting of sanctions. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. We'll have to see once this starts, but I think it's not going to be easy. There's a lot of domestic opposition to the Iran deal, in Washington, not just among Republicans. And I think it's going to be hard. I think it was a mistake to pull out of that deal. It was not perfect, but we should have found a way to sanction Iran for regional behavior without destroying the deal, just as Iran felt it could engage in malign regional activities and stay inside the deal. And I think there was too much enthusiasm for breaking the deal. And easy to criticize Obama and all of that, but the fact is, Iran's nuclear program was under control. It's not under control anymore. That is not good for Israel. And as the deputy director of the Mossad, who retired, so I read in the Israeli press, has made very clear it was a mistake to get out of that deal.
Sure. Going back to your Chinese experience in Egypt, in certain circles, there is this concern or anxiety about China and about the intentions of China. And you hear even some circles calling on the need to curtail some of the contacts with China. What do you think about this? Is China a threat to anybody?
Look, China is a rising power, and it's a relentless economic competitor. And if you're going to engage with China, or you want to influence China in any way, you better be as strong a competitor as they are. If you're not, they'll eat your lunch, you know. And I think the big question for Israel is Israel's name shows up way too many times in dark cyber stories. I don't know what's true or what's not. But when I read about different regimes from Burma to Saudi Arabia to others, relying on NSO and other Israeli origin cyber companies to repress their people or to engage in malign activities. Again, I don't know what's true. All I know is I keep reading this. And Israel's cyber companies and the damage they could do to Israel's reputation around human rights could be to the 2010s what the occupation of the West Bank was to the 70s and 80s on American campuses. That is something Israel should be thinking very hard and long about getting under control. Yeah. China is not a competitor to Israel. Israel's not. I mean, Israel's an apartment house block in China. It's an important small power and not to be diminished. But if I were Israel, I wouldn't be worrying about China. But I would be worried about Israel's reputation and not allowing its incredible cyber technologies to be used by some bad actors and apples to really sully Israel's reputation.
Well, point well taken. Last question. Ultimately, we'll emerge out of this terrible pandemic. Now, I think that it is clear that the forces that will take us out of there are the researchers, the universities, the scientists, and not necessarily the politicians. The question to you is, do politicians nowadays understand better the importance, the centrality of research, of technology, of science?
You know, I just don't think you can summarize or you can generalize, Yossi. You know, I mean, some do and some don't. Some in Israel do and some in America don't, or some in the Middle East do and some don't. You know, I think one has to simply step back and ask the question, you know, the question I ask every morning: what are the biggest trends shaping the world today? That's what I ask. 2004, I wrote about the world being flat. I would say the biggest trend shaping the world today is that we're in the middle of three nonlinear accelerations all at the same time with the three largest forces on the planet, which I call the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. So technology is accelerating. That's Moore's Law. Dan Senor talked about the acceleration in digitization. I couldn't agree more. Climate change and environmental destruction is accelerating. More and more destructive storms. And globalization is accelerating. And again, partly because of COVID. What we're doing right now is a manifestation of globalization. And so these three accelerations are actually making the world incredibly fast-paced change, incredibly fused. We're not just interconnected. We're not just interdependent. We're what my teacher and friend Dov Seidman calls, we're getting fused. Radically open. With this thing, anyone now is a publisher, a newspaper, a filmmaker, a paparazzi, all without an editor, libel lawyer, or filter. Radically open and radically deep. Radically deep. You may have noticed that we all started suddenly using the word deep. Deep state, deep fake, deep mind, deep research, deep medicine. Why is that? You know, it even seeped into popular culture. You know, the song that won the Oscars 2 years ago by Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper was called Shallow. But what was the main verse? I'm off the deep end, watch as I dive in. I'll never reach the ground, crash to the surface where they can't hurt us. We're far from the shallow now. Oh, Yossi, baby, we are far from the shallow now, okay? So technology is going deep. In fact, it's going so deep that we decided we couldn't just call that fake. We had to call that deep fake. Hebrew U had to decide their medicine research is going so deep. They had to call that deep research. They're toggling my DNA now, not just research. So when the world gets this fast, this fused, this open, this deep, the only way to govern it is with complex adaptive coalitions where business, technologists, government come together to create the governance for this. And Israel's election, which really parallels ours and others, is a nightmare of not being able to build that kind of complex adaptive coalition. And the reason China is doing so well is it can order it. I'm not recommending this, I'm just observing this. It can order a lot of those compromises you have to do to govern a fast, fused, deep, and open world from the top down. I'll just leave you with one story, which is related to this. I was in Israel, my last trip before COVID was February of 2019, and I ran into Amnon Shashua from Mobileye. And Amnon said to me, Tom, have you ever driven in a self-driving car? I said, Amnon, I was just at Mountain View and I rode in Google's Waymo car. He said, Mountain View. That's a grid. That's a grid. Try driving in a self-driving car in Jerusalem. So I did. I came up to Jerusalem. Amnon took me for a ride for an hour, a self-driving car in Jerusalem under Mobileye's, with Mobileye's technology, up, down hills, no two parallel streets, everything, people, Arabs, Jews crossing the street. Amazing experience. We got done. He told me a story, very interesting story. To test a autonomous vehicle in Israel or anywhere, you actually need a national insurance protocol that governs what is safe self-driving. Otherwise, anything you hit or anything that hits you, you get sued. So you can't develop the car. Well, it turns out the rabbis who run Jerusalem have no idea about safe self-driving. So what Amnon and Mobileye had to do was actually convene an ecosystem. It was their auto supplier, Volkswagen, Mobileye, the rabbis who run Jerusalem, and the Israeli Ministry of Transportation, and together they wrote the law because this technology was so deep. None of them alone could actually produce the law. So they wrote it together. It was so good that Yandex, Russia's Google, now tests their self-driving car in Israel. And China, you might want to tell your wife, Yossi, just took the whole Israeli law, translated it into Chinese, and made it their law. So they could do that. Can any country? So in a fast, fused, deep, and open world, if you don't have complex adaptive coalitions that can provide governance, okay, you are really not going to be able to thrive in this era.
What a fantastic story. I mean, I can go on and on and on, but I believe our time is out. And of course, needless to say that Amnon Shashua is a professor at Hebrew University.
Exactly.
Thank you, Tom, for this outstanding, wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.
Great to be with y'all.